April 19th, 1945. Late morning sunlight flickers through a haze of smoke drifting over southern Okinawa. The battle had raged for days, leaving behind only blackened ruins where villages once stood. Corporal Michael Torres, a 24-year-old from Texas, serving in the 96th Infantry Division, moved carefully through the rubble, his rifle raised and his finger resting near the trigger. He'd seen too much already, friends lost in ambushes, villages turned to ashes, resistance that came from every doorway and pile of stone. Every shadow might hide a sniper. Every sound might mean another fight for survival. But what Torres and his squad found that day wasn't another ambush. It was something no one had prepared them for. From the cracked ground, a wooden cellar door creaked open. A woman appeared, stumbling into the daylight, clutching a baby pressed tightly to her chest. She was barefoot, her face streaked with soot and tears. Behind her came others, maybe 30 or 40 villagers, men, women, children, all of them starved, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags and dried blood. The soldiers froze. The civilians froze too. For a long moment, both sides just stared at each other, two worlds that had only known fear. The woman spoke first, her voice shaking in rapid Japanese hands, trembling as she begged. Torres didn't need a translator. He could hear it in her tone, the pleading rhythm of someone asking for mercy. She wasn't begging to be saved. She was begging to be killed quickly before her baby suffered more. Torres had been hardened by war. He'd learned to shut his emotions off, to act without hesitation. But standing there watching that woman clutch her child, something inside him cracked. The armor he'd built to survive 6 months of combat began to crumble. He looked at his squad. Then slowly he lowered his rifle. He took off his pack and pulled out everything he had left. Cans of rations, crackers, chocolate bars. He set them on the ground and backed away, using gestures to show the civilians what to do. He mimed eating, pointing at the food, then at the children. For a moment, no one moved. The villagers stared at the rations as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The woman with the baby took one uncertain step forward, then another. When Torres nodded softly and smiled, she suddenly rushed ahead, dropped to her knees, and began to cry. The rest followed. Within seconds, the ruins were filled with the sound of desperate eating. The scraping of metal cans, the muffled sobs of people tasting food for the first time in weeks. Torres called to his men, voice cracking, "Give them everything we've got!" The squad hesitated. Those rations were supposed to last them through the next patrol, but one look at the starving villagers made the decision for them. One by one, they emptied their packs, placing every bit of food they carried into trembling hands. A boy, maybe 5 years old, bit into a piece of chocolate. His eyes widened, and for the first time since the battle began, someone smiled. Later, Torres would tell his commander quietly, "They thought we were monsters. All we did was give them lunch." That single act, simple, human, unplanned, became the moment everything changed. Before the Americans reached Yonabaru, Japanese civilians had already lived through months of horror. For weeks, the island had been pounded by artillery bombers and hunger. Every night, the sky burned red. Every morning, fewer people were left alive. Most villagers had hidden underground in cellars, caves, and makeshift shelters dug into the earth. They weren't just hiding from the battle. They were hiding from the people they had been told were demons. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters, men who tortured, mutilated, and killed civilians without mercy. Mothers were told to poison their children rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Teachers drilled schoolgirls to carry grenades for honorable death. To surrender was shame. To live under occupation was worse than dying. So when the woman stepped from the cellar that morning, she wasn't pleading for food or water. She was begging to be killed quickly to spare her baby the fate she had been told was coming. Her face showed no hope, only resignation. Her eyes asked for an end to fear. But the bullets never came. Instead, the American soldier she expected to shoot her smiled. And that moment shattered everything she had ever believed. Behind her, other villagers crept into the light. Some were so weak they could barely walk. The old men leaned on sticks. The children moved like ghosts. Many hadn't eaten in days, some in weeks. Their ribs showed through paper-thin skin. The babies didn't cry anymore because crying takes strength. When the soldiers offered them food, the villagers hesitated. They still feared poison, still thought it might be a cruel trick. But hunger is stronger than fear. One man, perhaps a teacher before the war, finally reached out, took a tin of crackers and broke it in half. He handed a piece to a boy beside him. The child ate, chewed slowly, and blinked in disbelief. Then he looked up at the soldier and whispered something too quiet to understand. The squad hesitated. Those rations were supposed to last them through the next patrol. In that shattered village, surrounded by ruins and death, enemies stopped being enemies for the first time. War had taken everything from them: homes, families, faith. But in that one silent exchange of food, something human returned. Later survivors recalled that they had believed death would come in the form of gunfire. Instead, it came as mercy, killing not their bodies, but their hatred. That was the first day the villagers began to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as men. Corporal Michael Torres wasn't a hero in the way war movies like to tell it. He was tired, sunburned, and running on stale coffee and fear. For 6 straight months, he had lived in the smoke of battle, fighting house by house, losing friends, killing strangers before they could kill him. You stop asking questions after a while. You just survive. But that morning in Okinawa, something inside him changed. He'd walked into that ruined village expecting another ambush. Instead, he found people who looked like walking shadows. Mothers too weak to stand children, whose heads seemed too heavy for their bodies. Their faces carried the same hollow stare he'd seen on dying soldiers, except these were civilians, unarmed, terrified, starving. He didn't hear gunfire. He heard stomachs growling. And in that sound, the noise of war seemed to fall away. Torres slowly lowered his rifle. His squad watched in disbelief. In their training, they were told never to let their guard down, not in Okinawa, not anywhere. But orders couldn't compete with what stood before them. Without a word, Torres knelt, opened his field pack, and began pulling out every scrap of food he had. Crackers, chocolate bars, canned meat, everything. He set it on the ground and stepped back. Then, using his hands, he made a simple gesture. Eat. The villagers didn't move at first. Fear had been drilled too deep. They had seen soldiers feed prisoners only to shoot them after. The woman with the baby hesitated, eyes darting between the food and the gun slung at Torres's side. Torres met her eyes, no shouting, no orders, just a nod. And a smile that said more than any translator ever could. That was all it took. She ran forward, grabbed one of the cans, and fell to her knees, sobbing. The rest followed. In moments, the air was filled with the sound of scraping metal, of rations being torn open with trembling hands. Torres called to his men, "Empty your packs, all of it." His squad hesitated. One of them protested, "Corporal, we need those rations." Torres's voice cracked. "Look at them, they're dying." And so, one by one, every man dropped his food on the dirt. Chocolate melted in the sun as Japanese civilians, people they had been taught to see as the enemy, ate in silence and tears. A boy no older than 6 took a bite of chocolate and looked up at Torres with wide eyes. It was the look of someone who just remembered that sweetness existed in the world. For Torres, that look hit harder than any bullet. He'd seen too much death, but in that moment he saw life again. When his squad leader finally approached and asked what had happened, Torres only said almost in a whisper, "They thought we were going to kill them. Instead, we gave them lunch." Later, other soldiers would say that moment spread like wildfire through the division. Units started carrying extra rations. Medics began treating Japanese civilians as they would their own wounded. What began with one man's decision to lower his rifle quietly rewrote the rules of war. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Only the faint sounds of eating echoed through the ruins, the clink of tin, the rustle of wrappers, the quiet sobs of people who finally felt safe enough to cry. American soldiers stood back, unsure whether to smile or cry themselves. They had been trained to fight, not to feed. Yet here they were, watching their rations disappear into hands that had trembled in terror minutes before. The woman with the baby couldn't stop weeping. She fed her child, first gently pressing food into the baby's mouth, even though the infant was too weak to chew. Then she looked up at Torres and whispered something he didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Gratitude, relief, a fragile kind of peace. Nearby, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, discovered chocolate for the first time. He bit into it, frowned at the sweetness, then smiled so wide his cheeks quivered. He turned toward the soldiers, his small face smeared with dirt and sugar, and held out the half-eaten bar as if to share it back. That tiny gesture broke everyone. Men who had seen combat on half a dozen islands suddenly felt their throats tighten. Some turned away to hide it. Others just let the tears fall. The squad sat down on the rubble with the villagers. No weapons, no barriers, just people eating together in silence. Someone pulled out a cigarette and passed it to an old man who took it with both hands and bowed. A medic crouched beside a child with a fever and gave him water from his canteen. For the first time, the Americans weren't soldiers, and the Japanese weren't enemies. They were simply survivors sharing the same exhaustion, the same hunger, the same humanity. Word of Torres's act spread quickly. In the following days, other squads followed suit. What began as one spontaneous act of kindness became a quiet movement. Soldiers began carrying extra food on patrols, not for themselves, but for the civilians they might find. Torres didn't talk about it much. He wasn't trying to make history. He just couldn't stand watching people starve. But that day, the American rations did more than fill empty stomachs. They shattered an illusion. For years, Japanese civilians had been taught to see Americans as monsters. Now they were meeting men who shared chocolate with their children. That moment of sweetness in the ruins would echo for generations. Because when compassion shows itself in a place built for hate, it doesn't just save lives, it changes them. What Torres saw in that ruined village was only a glimpse of a much bigger nightmare. By the spring of 1945, all of Okinawa had become a graveyard. Crops were gone. Wells poisoned by shellfire, livestock slaughtered or stolen by troops. Entire families lived on weed's bark and anything that could be boiled into something resembling food. When the battle began, about 300,000 civilians lived on the island. 3 months later, half were dead. Many were caught in the crossfire, but tens of thousands simply wasted away, slowly, quietly, as the fighting rolled past them. It wasn't random tragedy, it was the result of policy. The Imperial Japanese Army had seized nearly every grain of rice for its soldiers, leaving civilians with nothing. Villages were ordered to move out of fertile valleys so defensive positions could be built there. Farmers were forced into labor, not harvest. The army kept eating, the people didn't. Even worse, the government's propaganda machine told the starving that the Americans would torture and kill anyone they captured. So many hid in caves or refused food drops from U.S. forces, choosing to starve rather than surrender. By April, thousands were dying each week from hunger and disease.
Promised a better tomorrow.
Mothers buried their children in shallow pits and kept walking because grief took too much energy. When American troops pushed deeper into the island, they expected ambushes. Instead, they found hollow-eyed survivors crawling from holes in the ground. Soldiers who'd trained to kill now found themselves delivering emergency aid with no orders, no plan, and no supplies to spare. For the Americans, it was a kind of shock. They had come prepared for battle, not famine. Yet the map told a horrifying story of 300,000 civilians. Between 100,000 and 150,000 were already gone. Another 120,000 showed signs of severe malnutrition. 15 to 20,000 children were orphaned, most surviving on barely 200 to 600 calories a day, about a third of what a human body needs to live. In other wars, starvation was collateral damage. Here it had become a weapon. Okinawa wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a slow-motion humanitarian collapse, the kind no army manual could fix. And yet inside that chaos, compassion began to take root quietly, stubbornly, among the very soldiers sent to fight. No manual prepared them for what came next. There were no rules for feeding your enemy in the middle of a war. No orders covered what to do when starving civilians stumbled into your line of fire. But something in the hearts of those soldiers wouldn't let them look away. All across Okinawa, American units began to improvise their own rescue operations. Infantrymen who had been fighting street to street just hours earlier started carrying water cans and first aid kits instead of grenades. Medics divided what little medicine they had between wounded Marines and Japanese children dying from dysentery. Nobody told them to do it. They just could not do it. Private James Chen, a medic with the 1st Marine Division, later said, "One day I was treating Marines shot in combat. The next day I was holding Japanese kids dying of hunger. Nobody gave us orders. It just happened because it had to." Soon, what began as isolated acts of compassion spread across the island. Lieutenants authorized the use of rations for civilians. Engineers cleared wells and dug makeshift shelters. Medical staff turned damaged field hospitals into aid stations for anyone who showed up, soldier or not. By military standards, it was chaos. Supplies meant for combat operations were vanishing. Rations intended for troops went to feed civilians. Commanders worried about discipline and logistics. But higher up the chain of command, something remarkable happened. Instead of stopping it, they allowed it. The humanity of the troops had outpaced the policy of the war. Officers quickly realized that helping civilians wasn't just moral, it was practical. Civilians who received food stopped resisting evacuation.
Hold still now,
They
you're
began
safe
guiding U.S. patrols away
We
from
need more
traps,
bandages on
translating
Cot 12.
signs, even helping locate
almost done with
wounded
the dressing.
soldiers trapped
All
in
right, team,
caves.
lift on the count of 3.
Trust, once unthinkable, began to build where
We're establishing the
propaganda
safe
had
zone now.
ruled for
Keep the path
years.
clear.
Each small act, a cigarette, a chocolate bar, a shared meal, rewrote the story both sides had been told. The Americans weren't demons. The Japanese weren't faceless enemies. They were people surviving the same hell, each side shocked to find humanity still breathing beneath the rubble. And as the war dragged on, those unplanned moments of mercy slowly began to outnumber the acts of destruction. Okinawa was still burning, but something else was growing quietly in the ashes.
Point.
Yes, the alignment looks perfect from here.
Agreed. The team did excellent work today.
As American troops pushed north, they began to discover the island's hidden underworld, hundreds of caves carved into the limestone hills.
All right, hold up. We're close to the entrance.
Inside them were thousands of
Eyes open,
Japanese
check your
civilians
sectors.
who had not seen sunlight in weeks.
I see something moving
The
on the
caves
right.
were supposed to be shelters from bombs. Instead, they became tombs. Families huddled in the damp dark, surrounded by the stench of decay. They survived on rainwater and whatever roots or insects they could find. The air was thick with smoke from burning rags. Babies cried without sound, too weak to make noise. In many caves, there were more corpses than living people. When American patrols first approached, they heard whispers, then silence. Through interpreters, they shouted into the darkness, "Come out. You'll be safe. We have food and water." But the caves remained still. Propaganda had done its job too well. Many inside believed the Americans were calling them out only to slaughter them. Some even chose suicide over surrender entire families using grenades or poison rather than face capture. Sergeant Robert Morrison, part of a unit clearing caves near Shuri, remembered the first time they broke through a wall and found people inside. We could hear children crying. We called to them, promised food safety. Nothing. Then one woman came out carrying a baby. She was so thin she could barely stand. We gave her food instead of shooting her. She stared at us for a full minute, then turned and shouted something back into the cave. And suddenly they started coming out, 200 of them, starving, shaking, crying. That day, something extraordinary happened. One woman's courage opened the floodgates of fear. Word spread that the Americans weren't killing civilians, they were saving them. Slowly, caves across Okinawa began to empty. Troops built evacuation routes, opened new exits so people could escape without approaching the soldiers directly. Medics set up tents near cave mouths to treat the weak and wounded the moment they emerged.
Here, drink this!
Each rescue was a test of patience, empathy, and restraint.
Wrap this around you
The
quickly, we
soldiers
need to
never
move.
knew what they'd find, frightened families or soldiers ready to ambush. Every mission balanced danger and compassion. But for many, those evacuations left a mark deeper than any battle. They saw mothers clutching
Reds in Bay
infants like
2.
feathers,
Get 'em ready for
children
transport
blinking
now.
in the daylight for the first time in months, old men collapsing in
Pass
gratitude
them
just
down
to
the
feel
line, make
wind
sure
on
they're
their
secure.
faces again.
Clear on the left.
The
Coming
caves
through.
of despair became the first real bridges between two worlds.
We are here to help you.
Where
Everything
bullets
you
once
say is
echoed, now
confidential.
came the sound of coughing,
Okay, take your
crying,
time.
and
We will
relief.
make sure you are safe now.
And in that dim light spilling from the cave entrances, American soldiers and Japanese civilians finally saw each other, not through fear, but through shared exhaustion and mercy. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the shooting stopped, but the dying did not. Cities lay in ruins, farms were gone, transportation networks were shattered. The fishing fleet had been destroyed. Out of a population of 72 million, as many as 15 million faced starvation. In Tokyo, people searched through ash heaps for scraps of rice. Children fainted in the streets. Families boiled grass bark, even old leather to survive. The war had ended, but the hunger had not. When American occupation forces landed that fall, they found a nation on the edge of collapse. General Douglas MacArthur understood immediately that peace couldn't be built on empty stomachs. His order to the military government was simple and absolute. Feed the Japanese people first. Use whatever we have. That single directive changed the fate of an entire country. Ships that once carried ammunition now brought rice and wheat. Trucks that hauled artillery were loaded with powdered milk and flour. Warehouses built for weapons became food distribution centers. Between September and December 1945, the United States shipped nearly 800,000 tons of food to Japan. More than 15,000 personnel soldiers, sailors, and civilians worked around the clock to deliver it. Over 5,000 feeding stations opened across the country. 15 to 20 million people received food directly from the former enemy they'd been told to hate. It wasn't easy. Japan's infrastructure was in ruins. Rail lines were gone. Roads were clogged with refugees. Corruption and black markets siphoned off supplies. Yet somehow the system worked. American officers shared logistics tips with Japanese administrators. Translators worked double shifts to keep communication flowing. Local volunteers helped unload ships and distribute sacks of grain to neighborhoods still smoking from bombings. The relief effort wasn't just about calories, it was about
As you can
dignity.
see outlined in Section 3, the caloric
For the
intake
first
cannot
time
exceed
in
the
years,
specified amount per person
Japanese
per day.
families
Says the
sat
figures
together
must
for
be
full
followed
meals.
precisely for the duration of the quarter.
Children who had forgotten the taste of milk drank from tin cups. Elderly survivors cried as they held loaves of bread baked from American wheat. And little by little, the nation began to stand again. The hunger didn't vanish overnight. It took years to rebuild agriculture, restore trade, and reconnect cities to food supplies. But the foundation had been laid. The same military power that had once reduced Japan to ashes
You're doing very
was
well.
now being used to feed it back to life.
Try to drink this water slowly.
History rarely turns that sharply from destruction to mercy, from enemies to saviors. But in 1945, it did. The people who had once hidden from the sound of American boots now waited in line to receive rice from those same soldiers. And as the lines stretched through the streets of Tokyo and Osaka, one truth began to settle in. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won by force, but by compassion.
Life
Amid the
slowly
ruins of
returned to the
post-war
streets of
Japan,
Tokyo.
a quiet revolution
Here,
began
children navigate
in the
the
most
rubble to
unlikely
attend
place, the
class in
classroom.
1947.
By 1946, millions of Japanese children were malnourished. Teachers reported students fainting during lessons, their tiny hands too weak to hold pencils. Attendance had collapsed because many families kept children home to search for food. The nation's future was literally starving. The solution came not from generals or politicians, but from a simple idea: feed the children first. With American support, the school lunch initiative was born. Every child, regardless of family income, would receive a warm, nutritious meal at school each day. It started small, a few thousand meals in the burned-out cities, but grew with astonishing speed. By 1947, nearly 5 million children across Japan were eating daily lunches supplied by U.S. relief shipments. Each meal provided 600 to 700 calories rice or bread, a serving of vegetables, some protein, and for the first time in many children's lives, a cup of milk. To American planners, it was simple logistics. To Japanese families, it was salvation. Teachers began to notice something miraculous. Within weeks, students were staying awake in class.
God is great,
Within
God
months,
is
their
good, and
grades
we
improved.
thank you for this food.
Within a year, their
Amen.
height and weight began to rise. Attendance surged by 20% because parents knew that at the very least,
right
their
before he
children
spilled
would
his
eat
cup.
that day. The transformation reached far beyond nutrition. The school lunch became a symbol, a daily reminder that the future could be better than the past. Children
Did you
learned
finish
to
the math
line up
homework?
politely to give
way,
thanks
I'm doing it
before
right
eating
before
to share
class.
food
Me
with
too.
classmates. The meals also introduced them to unfamiliar American staples, bread, butter, canned fruit flavors that would become part of modern Japanese cuisine. In those classrooms, a new
Here's the chicken.
relationship
Oh, thanks.
quietly formed.
Do you want the salad? Yeah, I'll
To
take
the
that.
generation who grew up during those years, America no longer meant the faceless enemy from
Hold your
wartime
plate
propaganda.
steady now.
It meant full stomachs, warm milk, and the
smells
kindness of
delicious.
strangers who wanted them to live. One teacher in Osaka later said, "We had no textbooks, no chalk, no glass in the windows, but the children had food. And with food, they had hope." By the early 1950s, Japan's children were healthier than they had been in decades. The program had done more than feed a generation. It had rebuilt the emotional bridge between two nations once locked in hatred. Bread and milk had succeeded where bombs had failed. They brought understanding. And through those simple school lunches, America didn't just help Japan survive. It helped Japan remember how to dream again.
Cinderella, dressed in yellow, went upstairs to kiss her fellow. How many kisses did she get? 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right.
We are the world. We are the children.
Look at that. You've grown 2 inches since last time. You're doing a great job eating healthy.
The hard work is paying off. That's wonderful.
Here we go. Careful with that tray.
Thank you so much. It was really heavy.
No problem. Let's sit right here.